You owe the HOA $150,000 in retroactive payments. Those were the exact words that came out of the mouth of a man I'd never seen before in my life, right after he stormed into my newly inherited ranch, waving a stack of documents and yelling like he owned the place. It was a Tuesday morning, just 3 days after I'd moved into my late uncle's property in Colorado. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and I had just made myself a cup of black coffee when this red-faced man in a golf shirt and khakis marched right onto my porch like he'd been waiting his whole life for a dramatic entrance. "You're the new owner of this ranch?" he asked, already halfway through flipping open a binder labeled HOA Compliance Enforcement. "Yeah," I said slowly, confused and caught off guard. "I inherited it from my uncle, Mike. He passed away last month." "Right. Well then, you've inherited his dues. This ranch falls under the jurisdiction of the Spring Valley HOA, and your uncle hasn't paid his dues in 12 years. With penalties and interest, that comes to $150,000. I nearly dropped my coffee. "I'm sorry." "What?" He leaned forward and tapped the binder aggressively like he was auditioning for a court TV show. "You heard me. That's what you owe. And we'll be expecting a check within 30 days or we'll have no choice but to place a lien on the property." I was stunned. My uncle never mentioned an HOA, not once. And he was the kind of guy who would have told you if you owed $20, let alone $150,000. "Sir," I said carefully, trying not to let my frustration explode, "I don't even think this ranch is part of an HOA." His eyes narrowed and then, without even answering, he turned around, got into a black SUV with a Spring Valley HOA sticker slapped on the side, and drove off without another word. I just stood there, mouth open, coffee forgotten in my hand, wondering what in the world I had just walked into. What I didn't know was that this man wasn't just an HOA representative. He was the president of the entire Spring Valley Homeowners Association, and he was used to getting exactly what he wanted. But I'm not the kind of person who backs down easily, especially when something smells fishy. And this reeked. So how did I get here in the first place? Let me rewind a bit. My name is Jack Carter. I'm 34 years old, and until recently, I was a high school science teacher in Houston, Texas. My life was quiet. Normal. Too normal, honestly. No big drama. Just lesson plans, morning coffee, and the occasional grocery store sale that made my week. Then my Uncle Mike passed away. He was my mom's older brother, a bit of a loner, and one of the kindest men you'd ever meet. He never married, never had kids, and when I was young, he'd take me horseback riding every summer. His ranch was a peaceful place, wild, rugged, and untouched. It always felt like stepping back in time when I visited. He lived in a remote part of Colorado, about 40 minutes from the nearest town, and completely off the grid for the most part. Solar panels, well water, livestock, and no internet unless you counted the dusty old satellite dish that hadn't worked in years. When he died, he left everything to me. I was shocked, honored, and, frankly, clueless about how to run a ranch. But I felt like I owed it to him to at least try. So I packed up my life, quit my job, sold my tiny Houston condo, and drove up to Colorado with nothing but a U-Haul, my dog Max, and a mind full of curiosity. The ranch was beautiful. Acres and acres of rolling hills, pastures, pine trees, and creeks. The old farmhouse was worn but charming, and Uncle Mike had taken great care of the land. There were no neighbors in sight, and the driveway was a full half-mile long, complete with a wooden arch at the front that read Carter's Edge. But here's the thing. There were no signs anywhere that this property was under any kind of homeowners association. No gate, no clubhouse, no swimming pool or tennis courts, no Spring Valley HOA welcome packet. Nothing. Just miles of open land and silence. I didn't think twice about it, until that man showed up with a folder full of threats and a demand for 6 figures. At first I thought maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe the HOA had confused my ranch with a nearby subdivision or something. So I drove into town that afternoon and started asking questions. I stopped at the general store where a sweet older woman named Linda ran the place and seemed to know everybody and everything. Spring Valley HOA? She laughed. You're telling me they're trying to mess with Mike's land? Apparently, I said, still baffled. Honey, that land's been outside their boundary line since the day they drew 'em. Mike fought tooth and nail to keep it that way. There was a whole legal thing back in the day. He won. There ain't no HOA on Carter's Edge, never has been. That made my stomach flip. So the guy was lying? But why would the HOA say otherwise? I asked. Linda leaned over the counter, lowered her voice, and said, Because Rick, the HOA president, is a snake in khakis. He's been trying to expand the HOA borders for years. Wants to turn this whole area into some luxury development with golf courses and fancy townhomes. But Mike stood in his way. Wouldn't sell, wouldn't budge. So now that Mike's gone, Rick sees you as an easy target. I clenched my jaw. He picked the wrong guy. Linda grinned. Now that's the Carter spirit. I spent the next 2 days digging through every document my uncle had kept. Tax records, land deeds, court transcripts, HOA letters. And sure enough, about 10 years ago there had been a full-blown lawsuit between the Spring Valley HOA and Mike Carter, and Mike had won. The court order clearly stated that Carter's Edge was not part of the HOA and never had to pay dues. So I thought, great. Case closed. I made copies of the ruling, organized all the paperwork, and got ready to send it to Rick, the HOA president, with a letter that basically said back off. That's when I noticed something strange. Late one night, while reviewing the land survey maps, I saw that someone had hand-drawn new lines in pencil around Carter's Edge. And those new lines? They now included my ranch inside the HOA boundary. My heart pounded. I double-checked the date on the maps. The fake one had been marked just 2 weeks before I arrived. Someone was actively trying to rewrite the boundary lines, and not just on paper. The next morning, I woke up to find a crew of construction workers putting up a brand new HOA welcome sign right at the edge of my driveway. It read, Welcome to Spring Valley Estates, a proud HOA community. I marched down the dirt road in my slippers, still half asleep, and shouted, Who told y'all to put that there? One of the workers looked up, shrugged, and said, We got a permit from the HOA president. Said this road now belongs to the community. I stared at the sign, my jaw tightening. This was no mistake. This was war. And I had just begun to fight back. I stood there, in the cold morning air, staring at the shiny new sign the construction crew had bolted into the earth at the edge of my ranch. I could barely breathe. The bold letters mocking me. Spring Valley Estates, a proud HOA community. It felt like a punch in the gut. I didn't authorize this. My uncle would have never allowed it. And the documents I found said loud and clear, this land was not part of the HOA. Who gave you permission to install this? I asked again, firmer this time, pointing directly at the sign. Talk to Rick. The guy with the clipboard mumbled. We're just doing our job. I turned and stormed back up to the house, Max, my black lab, trotting nervously behind me. I grabbed the folder of documents and legal maps I had spent the last 2 days compiling and tossed them into the passenger seat of my truck. If this guy thought he could intimidate me into writing a 6-figure check, he clearly didn't know who he was dealing with. 20 minutes later, I pulled into the Spring Valley HOA office, a glassy little building tucked next to a strip mall, and marched straight through the front doors. There he was. Rick. He sat at the end of a long reception room, behind a big desk that looked like it had been polished every hour on the hour. His hair was slicked back, his teeth too white to be natural, and his golf shirt had the HOA logo stitched like he was running for office. Well, well, he smirked, standing to greet me. Mr. Carter, I take it you got our sign? Yeah, I snapped, slamming the binder on his desk. And this is your proof that what you're doing is illegal. He didn't even flinch, just opened the binder and flipped casually through the documents like he was skimming a menu. I see, he said smoothly. Yes, your uncle was quite stubborn. But unfortunately, there have been recent developments. The HOA restructured its charter last year, and with new zoning adjustments, Carter's Edge now falls within Spring Valley. My eyes narrowed. That's not how boundary lines work. You can't just restructure and draw in private land like it's a coloring book. Rick leaned forward and smiled like a snake. Well, the new map has already been submitted to the county, and while it's pending review, we're well within our rights to request compliance, including dues, back payments, and community integration. Integration? I repeated, shocked. You'll be required to paint your barn in accordance with the HOA color code, maintain a manicured front field, no livestock near the fence line, and your dog will need to be kept indoors after 7 p.m. I almost laughed. You've lost your mind. He shrugged. It's just business, Mr. Carter. If you don't like the terms, you're welcome to sell. There's a developer already interested. There it was. Now I saw it clearly. This wasn't about rules. It wasn't about community. It was about money. Rick was trying to bully me into giving up the land so it could be turned into condos or golf villas. But he made a big mistake. Because I had something he didn't expect. My uncle's will, land rights, and the original court ruling that excluded Carter's Edge from HOA authority. I pulled it out of my bag and laid it on the table like a final card in a poker match. This is a legally binding document from the district court, I said calmly. Carter's Edge is exempt, period. If you don't take down that sign and leave me alone, I'll have my lawyer file an injunction and sue this HOA so fast you won't have time to spin another lie. Rick's smile twitched, but before he could respond, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it. If you'll excuse me, he said, stepping into the hallway. I sat there, the tension still thick in the air, waiting, but something felt off. Too easy. When he came back 5 minutes later, he was all smiles again. Of course, he said, adjusting his collar. We'll take another look at your documents and be in touch. Have a great day, Mr. Carter. I didn't buy a word of it. Sure enough, by the time I got back to the ranch, the welcome sign was still there. Only now, it had been reinforced with fresh concrete. And that night, I heard an engine outside. Max started barking like mad, so I ran out with a flashlight in one hand and my grandfather's old hunting rifle in the other. There were tire tracks leading around the side of my barn. Whoever it was had taken off, but not before leaving a paper nailed to my front gate. It read, "Final notice. Failure to comply will result in lien placement and property seizure." I was livid. This wasn't just a scam now, it was a threat, and someone had driven onto my property in the middle of the night to deliver it. I stayed up late that night, pacing back and forth in my uncle's old study, flipping through documents, trying to figure out how they could get away with this. Then, a light bulb went off. I remembered Linda from the general store had mentioned something weeks ago about a surveyor in town who helped draw the original maps that kept Carter's Edge out of HOA control. I pulled out my phone and called her, even though it was nearly 11 p.m. "Linda," I said, out of breath. "Do you remember the name of that land surveyor who worked with my uncle back in the day?" "Oh, honey, of course. You're talking about Mr. Everett. He's retired now, lives up past the ridge. But if anyone knows the truth, it's him. Can I get his number?" "You better go in person," she warned. "He don't trust phones, or the internet, or people, really." The next morning I loaded Max into the truck and drove up the dusty hills, past the winding roads until I found the old cabin that matched the address she gave me. It was a small place, mostly hidden behind trees, with an old green truck parked out front and wind chimes clinking gently in the breeze. An old man in suspenders and a ball cap answered the door with a cautious squint. "You Mike's nephew?" "Yes, sir," I said. "Name's Jack Carter." He looked me up and down, then stepped aside. "Come in. I figured they'd come after you next." Those words chilled me to the bone. Inside, the place smelled of cedar and tobacco. Maps were rolled up in corners and old documents covered the table. "I've got everything," he said before I could even ask. "Original plats, legal lines, the boundary ruling from 2013. Rick's been trying to fake new ones, but they don't match the legal record. Can I get copies? He nodded. More than that. I'll sign an affidavit. Say I drew the lines myself. They can't ignore that in court. Relief flooded my chest. Finally, some backup, some truth. But before I could thank him, there was a knock at the cabin door. He raised an eyebrow. You expecting company? I shook my head slowly. He opened the door, and there they were. Two men in black HOA jackets, one holding a clipboard, the other holding a camera. Jack Carter, one of them asked, recording everything. You are being documented for non-compliance and illegal land use under Spring Valley HOA regulations. They had followed me. They were watching me. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was surveillance. And I was done playing nice. The moment those two men in black HOA jackets stepped onto Mr. Everett's porch with a camera rolling, I felt my blood pressure spike. Not because I was scared, but because the boldness of it all was absolutely insane. One of them shoved a laminated paper into my hand. Notice of non-compliance, Article 7, Section 4, Unauthorized Structure Consultation. Unauthorized what? I asked, staring at the paper like it was written in another language. You're trespassing on protected HOA land while consulting with an unlicensed surveyor, the man replied, pointing the camera at both me and poor Mr. Everett. Unlicensed? Everett barked, stepping forward with his cane. Boy, I was drawing boundary lines when your daddy was still learning to walk. I've got 45 years of surveying under my belt, and a court ruling that says Carter's Edge ain't never been HOA. The younger man flinched but kept recording. I raised my phone and started filming too. Perfect, I'm glad we're both documenting this, I said. Because this is harassment, and I've got evidence, witnesses, and legal documents that say you're in the wrong. The two men exchanged a look. Then the one with the camera lowered it and said in a cooler tone, Look, Mr. Carter, we're just following orders from the HOA president. If there's been a mistake, you'll need to bring it up through the proper appeals channel. Oh, you better believe I will, I shot back. Now get off his property before I call the sheriff. They left, but slowly, like they wanted to make sure I knew they'd be watching. Their tires spat gravel as they pulled out of Everett's driveway and disappeared into the trees. You all right? I asked Everett, who was still standing tall despite the tension. I'm fine, he grunted. This ain't the first time Rick's goons came snooping, but now you see what you're up against? Yeah, I said quietly. I do. He handed me an old leather folder. Inside were the original hand-drawn survey maps, notarized and signed. Take it. Bring it to the county office first thing tomorrow. And tell Sheriff Lopez I sent you. She don't like the HOA much. Thanks, I said, gripping it like it was gold. You might have just saved my ranch. But I couldn't shake the uneasiness I felt driving home. This was escalating quickly. Rick wasn't just being pushy, he was breaking laws, falsifying maps, and now trying to intimidate a retired surveyor and me in broad daylight. By the time I got back to the ranch, Max was growling before we even turned into the driveway. There was another truck there, a shiny black one, and it was parked inside my property. I hit the brakes and jumped out before the dust settled. There stood Rick, right in the middle of my field, with a real estate agent beside him. They were walking around my barn, pointing at things, talking numbers. I stormed up to them. What do you think you're doing? Rick turned around casually. Oh, Mr. Carter, I didn't realize you'd be home so early. Just showing the property to a potential buyer. Should you be interested in negotiating? I've heard you've been under stress. My fists clenched. Get off my land. The real estate agent hesitated. Wait, this property's for sale, right? No, I growled. This land is mine. It's not listed. He's trespassing. Rick shrugged. Well, if you don't comply with HOA guidelines soon, that lien's going to force a sale anyway. I'm just getting ahead of the process. Max started barking furiously. He could sense my rising anger. I'm warning you, I said, stepping closer. The next time you set foot on this property without permission, you won't be walking out so smug. Rick smirked, but the agent had already backed toward the truck, clearly shaken. They left, tires screeching as I stood there, chest heaving. My barn, my land, my family's legacy, being sized up like it was a strip mall waiting to be built. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing Rick's words in my head. If you don't comply, that lien's going to force a sale anyway. It didn't make sense. They couldn't legally place a lien unless I was a member of the HOA. But what if, somehow, they faked the paperwork? I needed help. Someone who knew the legal system better than I did. Someone who could go toe-to-toe with Rick's army of phony documents and shady enforcers. I remembered an old college buddy, Marcus, who was now a property attorney in Denver. We hadn't spoken in years, but I reached out anyway. The moment I told him what was going on, he said, "I'll be there tomorrow." True to his word, he showed up the next afternoon in a navy blue suit, briefcase in hand, sunglasses on, ready to wage war. "This is the kind of case law students dream of," he said with a grin. We went over all the documents together, the will, the boundary lines, the court ruling, Everett's affidavit. Then Marcus said, "We're filing a restraining order against the HOA and a cease and desist. They have no jurisdiction here, and we're going to make that very, very clear." By the next morning, we had submitted everything to the county clerk's office. And then, just as we were pulling into the sheriff's department to deliver a formal complaint, I got a call. It was Linda from the general store. Her voice was shaky. "Jack, you need to come down here, now." "Why? What's wrong?" "They just came through town with a bulldozer." I nearly dropped the phone. "What?" "They're heading straight for your land, said they're clearing space for community expansion. You've got to stop them." I turned to Marcus, who was already dialing the sheriff's number. "We've got a problem," I muttered. We jumped back in the truck and sped down the highway, my heart thudding with every mile. As we crested the hill overlooking Carter's Edge, I saw it. A massive yellow bulldozer, driving across my pasture, headed directly toward my uncle's barn. I slammed the brakes and flew out of the truck, screaming at the driver to stop. But he couldn't hear me. The bulldozer kept rolling. The engine roared louder. And then, crash. The front corner of the barn splintered like matchsticks. Wood flew. A support beam cracked and fell. And I dropped to my knees in shock as the place my uncle had built with his own 2 hands began to cave in. My home, my family's land, under attack. This wasn't just HOA overreach anymore. This was war. The sound of the barn collapsing echoed across the valley like thunder. I could barely move. My knees were sunk in the dirt, my fists clenched so tight my nails dug into my palms. All I could see were pieces of my uncle's legacy, the weathered boards he'd hammered himself, the hayloft we used to climb as kids, reduced to broken timber beneath the treads of a bulldozer. Max barked wildly behind me, straining against the leash. Marcus rushed forward, yelling at the driver. "Shut it down, now. You're trespassing. This is private property." The man inside the bulldozer finally killed the engine. He looked around, clearly panicked now that he saw us standing there, and climbed out, hands raised. "I swear I thought this was authorized. The HOA said they had approval, showed me documents and everything." "Who gave you those orders?" I demanded, marching up to him. He fumbled in his pocket, pulled out a crumpled letterhead. It had the Spring Valley HOA seal stamped in the corner, and Rick's signature. Marcus snatched the paper and examined it. "It's fake," he muttered. "The permit number doesn't even match the county's registry." I turned toward the barn, what was left of it, and something in me just snapped. Enough was enough. "You call the sheriff," I told Marcus. "I'm going to make sure Rick doesn't destroy anything else." By the time Sheriff Lopez arrived 20 minutes later, her patrol truck kicked up dust that settled like smoke around the collapsed barn. She stepped out in full uniform, mirrored sunglasses on, and took one long look at the scene. She didn't say a word, just whistled low and shook her head. "You really poked the bear, huh, Carter?" I nodded. "And now the bear's tearing through everything." Marcus handed her the forged document. "This is what their bulldozer operator was given. It's not legal." She glanced at it, then at the barn, then at me. You pressing charges? You bet I am. She scribbled in her notepad. You'll need to file a formal property damage claim with the county. But from what I see here, this is criminal trespass and destruction of private property. As the sheriff questioned the bulldozer driver, Marcus and I gathered what we could from the rubble. My hands trembled as I picked up a bent horseshoe and the old wooden sign that used to hang over the barn doors. Carter's Edge, Esther 1984. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was personal. Rick wasn't just trying to take my land, he was trying to erase my family's name from it. And still, Rick hadn't stopped. Later that evening, as I sat at the kitchen table with Max resting his head in my lap, Marcus's phone buzzed. He picked it up, listened, then looked at me with a grim expression. That was the county clerk's office, he said. Someone just submitted an emergency appeal to reclassify your land as community development property. I blinked. What does that even mean? It means Rick's trying to push a fast-track ordinance that would allow the HOA to seize the land under eminent domain if they claim it's for public benefit, like parks, roads, or housing. My jaw dropped. That's impossible. This is a private ranch. It's not even zoned for development. Marcus sighed. He's playing dirty, Jack. And fast. If that ordinance gets approved, you could be forced into a court battle that lasts years. But the sheriff saw the damage. We have the original boundary documents. Everett's affidavit. That's enough to stop this, right? Marcus hesitated. It should be. But we need someone on the inside. Someone in the county office who can make sure these appeals and fake maps don't get passed through quietly. That's when I remembered something. Linda, I said. The general store lady. She said her niece works in the zoning department. Perfect, Marcus said, already pulling out his phone. Let's pay her a visit first thing tomorrow. We got up early the next morning, drove into town, and found Linda already sweeping her front porch. Oh, honey, she said when she saw me. I heard about the barn. That man's got no soul, I tell you. We need your niece's help, I told her. Rick's trying to push some emergency zoning change. If he succeeds, I could lose everything. She nodded firmly. Say no more. I'll call Emma. She's tough as nails. An hour later, we were sitting across from Emma in a cramped office stacked with zoning maps and permit files. This isn't the first time Rick's pulled something like this, she said, shaking her head. Last year, he tried to rezone a creek bed to build a community fish spa. A what? Emma rolled her eyes. Exactly. He plays the system, buries the paperwork in legal jargon. Most people don't notice until it's too late. She opened her drawer and pulled out a form. But this time, he submitted the appeal without proper notice. That's a violation. I can flag it for review and notify the county board. It'll buy you time. But if he tries to resubmit, you'll need to be at the hearing. When is it? She glanced at her calendar. Friday morning, 10 a.m., County Hall. I looked at Marcus. We'll be there. But that wasn't all. On the way back to the ranch, Marcus got a call from a journalist friend of his who worked for the Denver Gazette. He'd forwarded a photo of the collapsed barn and the bulldozer with the Spring Valley logo still visible. Tell Jack, the reporter said. I'm writing a piece. Title, HOA Tyranny in the Rockies. I want to interview him tomorrow. When Marcus told me, I smiled for the first time in days. Good, I said. Let the world see what Rick is doing. That night, I sat out by the remains of the barn with a small campfire glowing. Max curled up beside me. The stars were clear above, and the air was still. Peaceful, but inside me, a storm was building. I wasn't just fighting for my land anymore. I was fighting for my uncle's legacy, for families who couldn't fight back, for everyone who'd ever been bullied by a man in a polo shirt who thought he owned the world. I didn't know what Rick would try next, but I knew this. I wasn't backing down, and neither was Marcus, neither was Emma, neither was Sheriff Lopez. The battle was far from over, but we just landed the first punch. And Rick? He was about to swing back even harder, because early the next morning, before the sun had even risen over Carter's Edge, a sheriff's patrol truck pulled into my driveway. Sheriff Lopez stepped out, her face serious, and behind her, a black tow truck. "Jack," she said quietly, "they just filed an emergency seizure order with the county judge, and I've been ordered to impound your truck citing unpaid community fees." I stared at her, stunned. "They're coming for your assets now." I stood there in my driveway, barefoot, still in my flannel pajama pants, watching a sheriff's deputy prepare to hook up my truck to a tow hitch. My truck, the only reliable vehicle I had on the ranch. Behind him, Sheriff Lopez looked as frustrated as I felt. "This is insane," I muttered, my voice trembling with a mixture of shock and rage. "They can't just file an order to take my truck." Sheriff Lopez nodded grimly. "I agree, but the judge who signed off on this order is a close friend of Rick's. The moment he filed that emergency community fee lien, they attached the asset claim to it. It's shady, Jack. Real shady. But it's technically legal, until we prove it was all based on false information." I turned to Marcus, who was already on the phone with someone, probably a contact at the courthouse. He motioned for me to hold tight. "This truck has nothing to do with HOA dues," I barked. "And I don't owe them anything. I'm not part of their damn HOA." Lopez raised a hand. "You don't have to convince me, Jack. But until the paperwork is reversed, I'm stuck following this order. I promise I'll make sure it's stored safely in town." I looked at Max, who was growling low in his throat beside me. The image of my barn being crushed just 2 days ago was still burned into my memory, and now my truck was being hauled off like it was some abandoned junker. This was no longer just legal maneuvering. This was financial warfare. Rick wanted to drain me, to push me into selling, to make this land more trouble than it was worth. But he underestimated me. Again. After the tow truck pulled away, Marcus finally got off the phone. "I got us an emergency hearing," he said, his voice tight. "Tomorrow morning. We're bringing everything. Everett's affidavit, the real maps, the HOA charter, the forged documents. We'll ask the judge to invalidate the lien, return your truck, and issue an injunction against the HOA." I nodded. "What do we do in the meantime?" "We prepare," Marcus replied. "Because Rick isn't done. He's going to try to bury you in filings before the hearing." He was right. Over the next 24 hours, a flurry of letters hit my mailbox. One accused me of unauthorized wildlife management, because I'd let a deer graze in my field. Another fined me $100 for lack of community standard fencing. And then, perhaps the most ridiculous of all, they sent a violation notice because Max, my dog, wasn't wearing an approved neighborhood pet collar. Marcus was livid. "This is a paper war, Jack. He's throwing everything at you, hoping something sticks or you run out of steam." But instead of backing down, I doubled down. I spent the rest of the night photocopying every document, highlighting every key phrase, and putting together a binder the size of a phone book. If Rick wanted a fight in court, I was showing up like it was the Super Bowl. The next morning, we drove Marcus's car to the county courthouse. Linda had already baked muffins and handed them to us, for good luck. And Emma texted that she'd be sitting in on the hearing to ensure Rick didn't try any more backdoor zoning tricks. We arrived at the courtroom, and there he was, Rick, dressed in his usual khakis and navy blue blazer, standing at the front like he'd already won. He even winked at me as we passed. I ignored him and took my seat. The judge entered. Court came to order. Marcus stood tall, calm, and sharp as a razor as he began. He laid out the timeline. My uncle's ownership, the court ruling exempting Carter's Edge from HOA jurisdiction, the forged maps, Everett's affidavit, the bulldozer destruction, the false lien, and the illegal seizure of my vehicle. Then he handed the judge the forged permit that led to my barn's destruction. The judge took one long look at it. Then she slowly removed her glasses. "This document," she said firmly, "is a forgery." Rick stood, trying to object, but the judge waved him down. "Mr. Weston, You submitted a lien and asset seizure request based on a falsified zoning document and an HOA map that has not been ratified or approved by the county planning office. I was told the documents were in process. They are not, she interrupted coldly. You and your association acted with gross overreach and deceptive practices. Marcus leaned in and whispered, "This is going better than I thought." Then the judge turned to me. "Mr. Carter, I'm formally dismissing the HOA's lien against your property. The asset seizure order is void. Your truck will be returned immediately. Furthermore, I am issuing a temporary restraining order against Spring Valley HOA, effective immediately. They are to have no contact with you or your land until a full investigation is completed." I felt the weight of 1,000 bricks lift off my shoulders. Finally someone saw the truth. Rick looked like a deflated balloon, lips pressed so tight they were almost invisible. But Marcus wasn't finished. "Your Honor, we'd also like to file a motion for damages. Mr. Carter's barn was destroyed under false pretenses. We will be seeking compensation from the HOA for the physical and emotional damage caused." The judge nodded. "You may proceed. File the motion with the clerk. This court is adjourned." As we walked out of the courtroom, the sunshine felt warmer than it had in weeks. Linda was waiting outside with Max. He had a new collar with a shiny bone tag that read, "Carter's Edge #1 Dog." When he saw me, he jumped into my arms, tail wagging like a tornado. We had won the first big battle, but I knew Rick wouldn't let go that easily. Sure enough, the next day I got a certified letter in the mail. Rick was appealing the court's restraining order, and included with the letter, a glossy brochure mock-up. Spring Valley Luxury Estates, Phase 3, coming soon, and right in the middle of the map, my ranch, my uncle's ranch. They hadn't given up. They were planning to take it, by any means necessary, and I was running out of time. I stared at the glossy brochure in my hand. The fake future of my ranch splashed across its pages in rich color. Winding paved roads, cookie-cutter townhomes, and a community clubhouse smack in the middle of where my barn once stood. The developers had even renamed the property on the map. Harmony Hills Phase 3, Nature-Inspired Living. I felt sick. Rick had no intention of backing down. The restraining order meant nothing to him. He wasn't just fighting dirty anymore. He was trying to rewrite reality. "They've already sent this to potential investors," Marcus said, looking over my shoulder. "If we don't stop this now, your land's going to be sold on paper before anyone realizes the fraud behind it." "But how?" I asked, pacing. "We already won in court. The order should have shut them down." Marcus closed the brochure. "Rick's appealing, remember? And while that's pending, he's trying to win in the court of public opinion. He's putting pressure on the county board, zoning commission, even planning an open house to show the land off to stakeholders." "An open house?" I repeated. "On my land?" "Next week," Marcus confirmed, but he made a mistake by mailing this. We now have proof he's actively advertising stolen land. I sat down slowly, running a hand through my hair. The man was relentless, and I couldn't fight forever. Or maybe I didn't have to fight alone anymore. A plan began forming in my head. Not through threats, not through more legal documents, through truth. I called up Everett, Emma, and even Sheriff Lopez. Then I messaged the Denver Gazette reporter who had published the first article. I told him I had more, a lot more. That week we set everything in motion. The day before Rick's open house, the local news van showed up. The Denver Gazette sent a photographer. The story had gained traction online. People were angry, thousands of comments. HOA tyranny in the Rockies had gone viral. Even ranchers from neighboring counties began arriving. Some brought signs. "Hands off Carter's Edge. This land ain't for sale. Our legacy isn't a development deal." I stood at the ranch gate the morning of the open house with Max by my side and a crowd of supporters behind me. Marcus wore his best suit. Sheriff Lopez parked her patrol truck at the end of the road, arms crossed. When Rick arrived in a rental Lexus, wearing sunglasses and a smug grin, he froze. He wasn't expecting this. Cameras, reporters, signs, shouting. He tried to push through the crowd. "This is private business. This is my right." Sheriff Lopez held up the court order. "Actually, this says otherwise. You're in violation again, Rick. You're now under investigation by the state's attorney general. They've received the zoning maps, the forged permits, and now the fraudulent investor materials." His eyes widened. "You can't prove I knew they were fake." Emma stepped forward, holding up the original maps and boundary records signed by Everett. "I can." And then, like clockwork, the Gazette reporter leaned in with a mic. "Mr. Weston, do you have a statement for the hundreds of homeowners and ranchers watching this story unfold across the country?" Rick stammered, looking around like he was surrounded. And for once, he had no answer. By sunset, the sheriff had escorted Rick off the property. The open house was canceled. The developer dropped their plans. And the county zoning board held an emergency meeting the next day, officially marking Carter's Edge as protected land, beyond the jurisdiction of the Spring Valley HOA. I won. Not just for me, but for my uncle, for my neighbors, and for every homeowner who'd ever been bullied by a greedy HOA president who thought they were above the law. A few days later, I rebuilt the gate and placed the original wooden sign back where it belonged. Carter's Edge, Esther 1984. The barn would take time, but with help from neighbors and volunteers, we'd rebuild it. Stronger, taller, on my terms. No HOA stickers, no threats. Just land, family, and freedom. So to anyone watching this story, just know, you're not alone. Stand your ground. Speak the truth, and don't let anyone take what's rightfully yours, no matter how fancy their polo shirts are. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, drop a comment to share your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel for more jaw-dropping HOA stories just like this one, because next time, it could be your land they come for. And now, they know we fight back.